Welcome to this month's Airchat Top 3 discussions with Naval Ravikant.
The term capitalism may have not been around, but free trade has been around as long as humans have been basically able to create and distribute products. They have freely exchanged them with each other. So the concept of what you call capitalism has been around forever. I think even though people have different preferences, the question here is which preferences can be engaged in freely and which require force. For example, if you leave people alone, they will trade with each other freely. On the other hand, if you want to be socialists and if you want to take the means of production from them, or if you want to take their output from them, that requires force. So it is moral to let people engage in free behavior. If you want to be a socialist and give what you earn to your family or to your friends or to your community, that is absolutely your right. That kind of socialism is fine and moral. But when you force people to give it up, that's the immoral part.
Well, I've been meaning to come back to this room for a few days. Brett, I do take your points. I think the positioning on Mao is a little inflammatory. You probably didn't mean it like that. But I think in a conversation like this, if we start kind of weighing those judgments, then no one's going to come out ahead. So I'm just going to move past that part. I would agree with Naval that certainly allowing what comes naturally is more moral. I do think there is a little bit of shades of gray, and it isn't about socialism or capitalism per se. But as I think we've discussed prior, China has very much embraced most of the free market and delivered a huge value to their citizens. I don't think you could point to another government who elevated more people in such a short amount of time economically and probably in their quality of life in the history of humanity. But of course, there are going to be trade-offs, and I have a question that I'd like to ask next. But in thinking about this, I realize that there's an element of government intervention in both systems, and Brett calls that out correctly. That USA is not a perfect example of that. I think we're all learning that China is a better example of that than we had previously suspected. So I'm going to frame it in terms of this. China has an out-facing currency and an in-facing currency in a very export-driven economy, which means that the actors in their free market internal economy have to be aware of the dynamics of the external-facing currency controls. But there's definitely a fudge factor in there, or I feel like there's a fudge factor in there. But what's interesting is that part of the fudge factor is used to promote national, business within the confines of China. So interestingly, I think China gets a lot of accusations of currency manipulation, which is true, but maybe can be looked at in the following view, where China has an internal economy and an outfacing economy, and that's how they've decided to design their system. I can't help but look at, for instance, the real estate issues that China seems to be facing right now and compare them with the real estate issues that happened. It's a question in any system of where that slack builds up and where the government sort of hides the layer of abstraction that makes a lot of the benefits to their population easier to get, i.e. real estate prices. So the U.S. government, by subsidizing the mortgage industry and carrying all those loans and enabling that system, absolutely puts in a layer of socialistic insulation from harm that I think China does the same thing in the difference between their internal and external currencies. And what I'm coming around to, again, I'm not trying to make some global moral point about which country is better or worse. I'm really just trying to understand the dynamics of the country. And I'm learning a tremendous amount in talking to Atmanan about this. And I think in reasonable conversation, of course, I'm aware that strong statements that are negative about Mao Zedong are going to be greeted with the same sort of reaction that any person from any country would have in having their dirty laundry aired in a quote-unquote good faith conversation. And I thought of an interesting way to rephrase this from the point of an individual. I think I know what I would do in the United States. I think Naval knows what he would do in the United States and maybe other countries. Maybe we should look at it like if you are an able-bodied, educated, healthy person at, say, 18, 20, 22 years old, you are airdropped into a foreign place, but you have some basic understanding as if you were raised by good parents. You have some basic knowledge. You have all the knowledge you have now. The language isn't an issue. You have some colloquial understanding of the economy. What is the path from that person who's airdropped in essentially with no resources, homeless, but not major physical or mental deformities, what is the path to that person becoming successful? Because I think answering that question does answer Warren Buffett's view of like the genetic lottery, where it's a question of like, if you're born into such and such a place, how well will the average able-bodied person do in general? Now, of course, I struggle to keep up with all Brett's tips, and now I've put too many of my own. So I would ask you, Atmanan, and maybe other people in the room who know about other economies or the U.S. economy, what's the pathway look like for an able-bodied person of good intellect and education and upbringing to map from $0, zero places to live, zero food, to being able to at least put a roof over their head, feed themselves, and have some disposable income being generated, which they can invest and do other things.
This is an awful truth of the circumstance. The people that praise Mao were close and are close to the Communist Party and to the levers of power. And it's a selection effect because they're the people who survive. They look back with rose-coloured glasses. After all, Mao only died in 1976. So those who survived the Great Leap Forward, they look back with fond memory because they weren't tilling the fields. They instead were, again, close to the levers of power, close to members of the party who received the privileges. But the overwhelming majority of the Chinese don't, even to today. The people who haven't benefited from the limited amount of capitalism, we don't hear from them because either they're long dead or they're still tilling the fields. Their families are still working in very basic factories, doing hard labour, that kind of thing. Or they've been disappeared to concentration camps. All of that is actually still going on in China. There's a selection effect. The only people on social media telling us about how wonderful China is are the limited few. That's the selection effect. Returning to this graph here, so we see a sharp increase in the amount of growth, and then we see a decrease in the amount of growth, which means that people are still being lifted out of poverty, and that's only a good thing. But why has there been a decrease? Well, because Xi Jinping, the current dictator, was on the ascendancy, has gained power, and has wound back a vast amount of the freedoms that were previously gifted to the people of China. And again, as I say, it's not capitalism across the board. It's a limited amount, and that limited amount can have huge effects because there's a vast number of people in China. So you only have to do a small amount to have a huge effect. But since things have been wound back, we see a decrease in what was huge growth in China. How bad is Xi Jinping? How much damage has he caused? Well, put it this way. He has undertaken an anti-corruption campaign. That's a wonderful euphemism. Throughout his entire term, he's been against corruption, so it's called. But really, it's a purge. It's a purge on the level of Stalin. You can look this up. I'm not making up these numbers. Around about 2.3 million government officials have been prosecuted. 2.3 million. That's from a Chinese source. So this is not a great guy, and this is not kind of an example of wonderful progress. It was an example of wonderful progress because of the opening up, but the opening up has long since ceased, and there's mass surveillance in China. There's a lot that we could talk about in terms of the problems of China. It once seemed to be on the right track. Xi Jinping has taken it off the right track. And unfortunately, you do get a lot of praise from people in China. But as I said, it's a selection effect. And people are vociferously in support of Xi Jinping. And why? Well, because they're the favoured elites. And they engage in a mass propaganda campaign on social media. It's the red heart thing, if you know anything about that. The voices that you hear are not representative typically of the vast number of people who still live in the rural parts of China. The people who live in Beijing and Shanghai are the privileged elite. And Well, no wonder they're happy. They're wealthy and good on them, and that's great. But capitalism should be spread everywhere. It's not in the USA and it's not in Australia, granted, but the difference between the rights afforded to the people close to power in China and the rights afforded to people who are not are very different compared to the rights afforded to everyone in the United States. Why were these 2.3 million government officials removed from the government? Why were they prosecuted? Why were they put in jail? They were the supporters of Deng Xiaoping. They were the ones who were on the side of reform. So they were the ones who argued for capitalism and against a return to an insular, authoritarian-looking China. That's one problem. And it's common knowledge now that China has the greatest mass surveillance program in existence that has ever existed in humanity. They have a social credit system, which is the most dystopian way of organising society. All of these things stand in stark contrast to what a genuine capitalist society should be and what genuine capitalism is. This doesn't make people really free to trade, because if you trade the wrong things, if you do the wrong things as a business, or you buy the wrong things as an individual, your social credit score suffers. Now, in spite of all that, there's still improvement. But to say that they're tending in the direction of capitalism, well, they're tending in the direction of capitalism more than they were under Mao. That's absolutely true. And you don't have to do much in order to improve things in order to get away from Mao in comparison. And just by the way, the reason why this is all fresh in my memory and on my mind is because I spent the last few weeks constructing this particular podcast, which should be live by the time anyone accesses this. It's not mainly about China at all. It's just, as a side issue, as an example, a case study, I call it. I talk about China in terms of free speech, free trade and democracy. And I compare it to places that are worse, like North Korea, and places that are better, like Japan and the United States. And so all in reference to chapter 15 of The Beginning of Infinity, the evolution of culture. So I had to look all this stuff up and cross-reference it and check it and so on and talk to people. And I was surprised, okay? I did buy into the idea that, the capitalism thing is so great in China. I genuinely did think that for a long time. But I began to realize that it's capitalism for the few, not for everyone. In America, people fail to the extent that they can be unlucky, fair enough, and they can choose not to work, and this can explain why they're not failing. But it's not really in general because the government's not permitting them the freedom to earn money. But in China, that can often be the case.
So as far as that growth that's a total chart crime. If an economy grows at 10% for 30 years, that's a 17x increase in the GDP. No system can go like that go on like that forever. If you extend it out, it's something like a 30 times increase in GDP while their population roughly tripled. So they're doing okay. And I could point at lots of geopolitical things and make hay about and disparage China, but I'm not really interested in doing that in these rooms. Like, for instance, you could point, and now I'm deeply capitalistic and I have my own geopolitical feelings from the media I've taken in and the research I've done, but I'm really enjoying hearing about China from a Chinese person's point of view. And I don't think there's any value in taking his, firsthand account of what he thinks of things and then throwing on these, principles that as some sort of slapping mechanism. Australia has no clue what a real world power looks like. And even in the United States, another democracy could look at them and say, oh, well, they lost the popular vote, yet they're still president. So that system is broken. We need to liberate those people from the system. Everyone's got mud on their shirt. So it's not that I can't take a strong position advocating for what I think is the correct geopolitical positioning of things, but I don't think it's a good use of these types of rooms.
When I have forgiven people in my life, it's because of three factors that slowly dawned upon me. The first was just being more objective and seeing that perhaps what they did wasn't really aimed at me. It was a byproduct, and perhaps I misinterpreted, or it was my fault. The second was valuing them and that moment for teaching me so I could make better decisions about people and situations in the future, to improve my judgment and to develop wisdom around the long-term consequences of associating with people like that and of my actions and their actions. But most importantly, it's just to get them out of my head. It's just not have to think about them. It's just not to have to carry a grudge. It's just not to have the emotional turmoil. It's just not to invoke the self. It's just to have peace. And that's the best reason to forgive someone. Just get them out of your head.
Do you ever regret forgiving people? I guess people that you wanted to keep in your life? Repeat offenders maybe? Or do you just see the things that they do differently now and not as things that need to be forgiven, but more so as part of them and not really worth not having them in your life?
Yes, even the people that I, supposedly forgive for their supposed infractions, I end up just removing them from my life. They just disappear because my life is full. I don't have time. So I'm always making choices about who and what to spend time with.
When I think about repeat offenders, I think about family, people that are harder to remove from your life, or you may not want to remove them from your life. Supposed infractions. Love it.
Yeah, family is a more difficult situation, but obviously, even with family members, you're still always making choices on how much to engage with them and on what topics with which to engage with them. So there's still a choice being made.
I think a good rule of thumb here is forgive, but don't forget. You can forgive a person on what they did to you. That way it's out of your mind and you're not using it as an excuse to not move on or to keep going forward in life because of such event happened. However, you should not forget how they acted and what kind of character and actions they're more likely to do. That way you don't engage with them in the same manner, even if they are family. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. But in my case, I have a really close family member whom one decision affected not only my whole youth, it still affects me now, and it probably will affect me until I die. But the fact that I can still talk to him about it gets me closer to closure. And the closer to closure it can be, the more likely it is that you're going to find peace by not only analyzing, but understanding both sides of the circumstance. And by understanding both sides, you get more clarity, and then it might get you closer to peace. And the closer to peace you are, the more likely it is you're going to be able to move forward. The worst situation you can be in is when that person's gone and you can't reach closure. So you're always going to be left with a what if. So if that person's still alive and it's not something that's very traumatic, but how their one decision affected your whole life, try to find a little bit of closure. It might get you closer to forgiveness, but you should not forget how they acted, and that way you don't expose or open yourself up to that again. I mean, we're learning creatures, so we're always going to learn.
Yeah, talking about what if situations and thinking about those situations is absolutely useless. It's actually the work of the devil, if you ask me, because there is no what if. There is only here and now and the future. So that's about it. And it's important to have your own peace and to simply let people go if they want to go, and if they want to stay, let them stay.
Very nice room, Mickey, and also very interesting opinions and thoughts about forgiveness. One of the recent incidences that I faced kind of made me realize that my mind is the one that hurts, and because it is hurting, it has a strong sense of identity, and therefore when I choose to forgive consciously, I'm actually strengthening my own hurt in some way. So that's why I'm able to consciously say, I'm forgiving. So sometimes I'm thinking, or at least recently I've come to think that because I'm consciously forgiving, I'm not forgiving. I do not know what it means to forgive. And in order to forgive, I don't have to feel hurt. and I don't have to feel associated to my self-identity. So therefore, for me, it's a practice of cultivating generosity to a degree where it does not constitute any sense of association to the self. Therefore, the identity of true forgiveness is actually the identity of true hurtfulness to self. So I'd like to cultivate generosity and compassion more and more to be able to not have this identity associations and come to a point where to forgive is to forget.
For me, forgiveness is something I do for myself. There is no other person in the equation. It's because I'm not in a position to care about how my forgiveness affects the other person, or what they do with my forgiveness, or how they change their behavior. That's not in my domain. It's something for them to figure out. So if I forgive someone, it's solely to get them out of my headspace and to move on to better things.
I absolutely love this take. It's it's so true. To forgive, somebody has to forgive. So you're just perpetuating an identity, the self, the same self that could be hurt again and would have to forgive again. Would have to forgive the, as Naval put it, the supposed infractions. So either remove the person or remove the self. And that's only possible through presence and love and compassion. So, yeah, I'd say I agree. Love it.
Naval, I saw you say in another room that real truth seekers don't accept lies, even if it's for short-term gain. I'd love if you can expand on that. The intention behind this room was for me to call out moments when I believe in falsehoods, just to recognize them and course correct, unless it's some kind of white lie.
When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you would wish to believe or by what you think could have beneficent social effects if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts.
My impression is that you're aligned with that last quote from Bertrand Russell.
I really liked Sifu's distinctions between truth tellers. Like, if you say to somebody the truth, but they distort it and just can't receive it and create a new lie, it's not useful. And so, yeah, I agree that it's best if you're a truth teller, but you craft your message so the other person don't just create a new lie or just sees you as an offender and somebody that they shouldn't hang around.
I agree. I think it's usually possible to be honest, but spoken with love at the same time, and that's a challenge. How do you tell the truth, but do it in such a way that it's not personal and it's not offensive? I meant it in the sense that you don't accept lies for yourself because they're convenient. It's mainly about yourself, and you always try to stick to the truth, no matter how difficult it is. Externally, you don't have to be super harsh, especially when it's like little harmless white lies. But yeah, generally, if you're in a situation where you need to accept lies to stay in that situation, you should leave that situation. It's not worth it. But like all generalizations, it's often false, and so really depends on the context. It's just an analog of how Warren Buffett supposedly doesn't even bet on silly things because he's not a gambler. The same way I would say that an honest person doesn't tell lies whenever possible because they're a truth teller and they're a truth seeker.
I have a theory about this, that we only realize the lies that we tell ourselves in hindsight. But if you ask me right now, what lie am I telling myself currently, I don't think I would be able to answer it with full honesty because I probably don't think it's a lie.
I think I agree. It's probably why I'm not able to list out the lies I'm telling myself currently. But when I think about the lies I've told myself in the past, they come to mind pretty easily. So you're right.
Maybe the lie we tell ourselves is that we're more self-aware than we actually are.
Can't say you're wrong, because that's a misunderstanding I've got myself with a couple of times.
Yeah, that's helpful. One category of lies, maybe addictive thoughts, whether it's being addicted to like an actual drug and lying to yourself about that, addicted to a person, someone who's toxic in your life, or just a false belief. Important to catch yourself and be self-aware about that. Yeah, I feel like dopamine-driven lies are also hard to recognize in real time. Like when you know you should be doing something else, but you lie to yourself temporarily to do something that's mostly a short-term pleasure.
Jerry, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it.